Welcome to Ethics. I'm Tom, and today we are talking about consequentialism. Consequentialism is the second of three major ethical theories that we cover. And here with consequentialism, we are looking at Mill's utilitarianism, which is a brand of consequentialism. I'll use the term consequentialism and utilitarianism interchangeably because Mill's view is the only consequentialist view we'll be looking at. He'll be our major representative of that, and he's very much a classical kind of consequentialist. But it's also important to note that we are moving into the kind of modern period of philosophy. So Mill's writing in the 19th century, I believe, and so we've kind of jumped in time quite a bit from Aristotle. So the thing about consequentialism, I mean, that I like to use that term because consequentialism is an intuitive term, because what is important for a consequentialist analysis of an action is, in terms of its morality, whether it's moral or immoral thing to do, is the consequences that the action produces, right? Um, uh, uh, Very simply, a consequentialist view of ethics takes actions to be right or wrong based on the consequences they produce. If they produce good consequences, then that action is good. If they produce bad consequences, then that action is bad. Um, and something that we'll talk about towards the end, but notice that this really leaves out any sense of motivation or intention behind what you're doing. As long as what you do like turns out to be okay, then it's okay. It's very much a proof is in the pudding kind of view. Now, Mill's general principle that he uses to evaluate actions is what he calls his greatest happiness principle, right? And he says actions are right in that they promote happiness, and wrong insofar as they promote the reverse, right? So when we're talking about the consequences, the relevant kind of consequences that we're after are the amount of happiness it produces for people, right? How much pleasure it produces overall. So um, it's a very simple idea, right? This should not be perplexing, right? It should almost sound too simple to us. But there is a lot packed in here, right? Now, if you look at the greatest happiness principle, um, what it might sound like to us is something like hedonism. Now, they talk in the readings about hedonism in a particular way that I'm going to come back to. But when I'm mentioning hedonism, I mean more in the sense of the kind of common sense notion of hedonism. And if someone is hedonistic, what we tend to mean is that they are very focused on pleasure, right? We tend to think of hedonism, and they also talk about the Epicureans, right? Um, People who kind of center their life around attaining pleasure, right? Eating good food, having sex, maybe doing drugs or drinking, these kinds of things that give you these very immediate pleasures. Um, Now, when it comes to Mill's greatest happiness principle, although he is focused on happiness in terms of pleasure, he is not that he's not promoting that classical view, that kind of common sense view of hedonism. Um, uh, and there are two important ways in which Mill distinguishes himself from what we might think of as kind of a traditional hedonistic lifestyle. One is that he's not concerned with individual pleasure exactly. He's concerned with our joint pleasure, right? The pleasure of everyone involved. So the sense in which it's the greatest happiness principle is not that to give you the most happiness exactly. It's more about the happiness of all, right? That's the sense of greater happiness. It's very much like seeking the greater good, So that's the first way in which he's not that kind of narrow view of hedonism. The second thing is that the way he understands happiness. If you notice in the reading, they talk about the distinction between higher and lower pleasures. So Mill wants to make a more refined account or sense of pleasure that is in play for him. So pleasure is not just about eating and drinking and doing things that give you kind of like immediate sense of satisfaction. Um, there's also kind of higher forms of pleasure, right? And those are the kind of pleasure you get from studying something that you never knew about, the kind of pleasure you get from, finishing an art project or, maybe watching a film, all kinds of things that we do that are more refined, kind of exercise our more refined capacities as rational beings, usually, right? We get a certain sense of pleasure from engaging in relationships, from helping others, all kinds of things, right? And for Mill, he weighs those heavier than the kind of immediate pleasure we get from bodily pleasures, right? And so, with those two things, what consequentialism really looks more like is our the very kind of common sense idea of the greater good, right? If your action promotes more happiness amongst all the people involved in that action or all the people affected by that action, then it's right. Okay. And if it does more harm than good, right? If it takes away happiness from more people who are affected, then it helps, then it's considered to be wrong, right? So um there are lots of interesting examples here that kind of highlight this. I mean, one is the idea of stealing a loaf of bread to feed a starving child, right? Um, Now, for Mill, even though we tend to regard stealing as wrong, in that case, say you're stealing a loaf of bread from King Supers, and you use it to feed a kid who hasn't had food in days, right? Then it seems like it raises the happiness of that child quite a bit. And the negative impact to King Super is probably minimal to none, right? And so for Mill, there the pros outweigh the cons, right? Um, so that's, I mean, an example. There are lots of cases in which, you sacrifice one to help the many. That's a very consequentialist line of reasoning there. But also, there are some funny things to do with this. So if you take the same scenario of stealing a loaf of bread to feed a starving child, if, you steal the loaf of bread and you have all the intention of helping this child, but you did it kind of hastily and you didn't know that the bread was moldy, right? And it ends up making the kid really really sick, right? Then it really doesn't help that kid, and it might have some negative consequence for the store, and you add those things up, and the overall happiness kind of went down for everyone involved. And so for Mill, even though you might have had the best of intentions, what you did was wrong, right? So we're really kind of like, it's really about the outcomes of your action, and that's really it. Um, Now, of course, depending on how complex a situation is, you might really have to weigh a lot of things to figure out what the right thing to do. If it's all based on consequences, there are lots of cases where, there are a lot of factors in play. There are a lot of people who would be affected. If you're, I don't know, deciding whether or not to go to war in a particular country or something like this, and you don't know which way things are going to go, um, and there's lots of people that might be potentially affected, then you really need to kind of like sit down and figure this out. And so For Mill, he has kind of a framework for doing this, and one way to do this is to do what's called a utilitarian calculus. And I have a handout on how to do this, um, just to kind of emphasize this idea of weighing the pros and cons and kind of figuring out whether or not an action is right by looking at the overall happiness and how that overall happiness either goes up or goes down. And the way I do it in the handout is to just list all the people that you think are affected or going to be affected. And you have to kind of take a measure of where their happiness is at, right? And then you kind of see what the action, how it would take away someone's happiness or add to someone's happiness, right? And then and then you kind of add them all up, add up all the happiness points, so to speak. And if the overall happiness points goes up, if your total goes up, then that action's right. If the total goes down, then the action is wrong. And it really doesn't matter how each individual is affected exactly. It's more about overall how much happiness there is, if there's an increase or an overall decrease, right? So that's the basic framework for consequentialism here. Um, now, soon we will be going over an alternative view, which is deontology, which is going to, want to focus more on intentions and the principles by which we act. But that's really not the way that Mill sets things up. He really thinks it's only the consequences, how much happiness is produced, how much overall happiness. So, anyways, that is it for now. I will be talking with you soon.